Ms Mitchell.
Mr Johnson, I am instructed by Amar Anwar and Company on behalf of the Scottish COVID Bereaved. In his evidence to the inquiry, Lord Edward Udney Lister was asked about a chain of emails where the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was requesting a telephone call with you. And this was on the 5th of March 2020, an important day because it was the day that COVID was added to the list of notifiable diseases. So it was a landmark day. An answer to asking why there was a reluctance to have the First Minister contact you, Lord Edward Udney Lister gave the following evidence, and this is from the transcript of 7th November 2023, page 105. Well, I mean, as you can see from the exchange of emails, the meeting took place, so I certainly wasn't trying to block that meeting taking place, but there was quite a lot of tension between the Prime Minister and the First Minister. They had no real personal relationship of any kind, other than that they, I think, generally didn't like each other very much. I would like to ask, is this a fair characterisation of the relationship between you and the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon?
Oh, I'm sorry to hear Eddie said that. Actually, I had no ill will whatsoever towards the First Minister of Scotland. When I've talked to her, we've got on very well and had a friendly relationship. And as I think you just said, we did indeed have a meeting.
Is it odd that such a close and senior person working for you got that impression?
Well, I think that let's put it this way: much as I love the SNP, they weren't politically. There was a certain amount of toing and froing between the SNP and me as the Prime Minister. I think I wouldn't like to produce everything that they've said about me over the years. But
let's just focus on these particular questions. You say you had plenty of opportunity to meet the leaders of the devolved administration, but as my learned friend, one of my learned friends has already pointed out to you, between May and October you hadn't. If it were to be correct that you had a certain degree of reluctance to meet with the First Minister, does that play into the fact that there were so few meetings during this time?
I think we've gone into the reasons for all this quite a lot, and I think I think Nicola was at a Cobra that we had quite shortly thereafter. I remember a conversation, a long discussion involving us, and several discussions involving her at meetings throughout the pandemic, and genuinely my relations with her have always been friendly and professional. I think the reasons for the approach that we took was, as I've been saying to others, that I thought a grown-up way of doing this that would take the steam out of things, keep things focused on the needs of the UK public, would be to manage it in the way that we did.
And why would, as you say, taking the steam out of things, why would that require Mr Gove to be appointed to the role?
Well, I think, as I say in my statement, I think he was well suited to the job of bringing people together, hearing people's opinions, conciliating, without people who are not necessarily my number one political fans feeling the need to chip paint off the government.
Mr. Johnson, you say, I don't need this up, but you say at paragraph 191 of your statement that you've given to this inquiry that sometimes when you had to make political decisions about what was going to happen with the country, sometimes decisions were urgent and needed to be made extremely quickly, which could present a challenge. Either we would need to convene a Cobra, invite the DAs to a cabinet meeting or a UK government subcommittee meeting at which their role was not always completely clear, or we would need to take a decision ourselves and bring the DAs on board. None of this was ideal. Now, as we've seen from this inquiry as it's taken place, a lot of government in the modern day appears to be done by way of very fast means of communication: text, email, WhatsApps, phone, video conferencing. Why do you consider that consulting the DAs would have prevented urgent decision making?
I'm sure there could have, in an ideal world, perhaps we could have found a way of doing it. My concern was that the DAs would understandably and use their legitimate prerogatives to do things differently, and from time to time to come out of what were meant to be confidential meetings and understandably want to talk to their own media within the DAs about what was going on and to explain the position. Now, I think the inquiry needs to reflect upon this, and it's not for me to say what the inquiry needs to reflect on, but I've found that it was a difficulty during the conduct of the pandemic. The virus doesn't respect any borders within the UK. The virus doesn't respect administrative boundaries.
With respect,
we saw this problem with the tiering approach. I think that we need to think as far as we possibly can about ways of getting a unified message, and I say that with maximum respect to the DAs and to their.
I'm coming on to the issue of messaging. That will be a chapter I will develop. But at the moment, I would like to stay with the issue of how to interact with the DAs in the times of, for example, a pandemic. You have talked about there needs to be a structure that should be put in place to allow for consultation between the UK government and the devolved administrations during emergency situations. And you have indicated that what you would like is a leak-proof integrated system. Can you help the inquiry as to how that might be done?
Not at present, no, because I think it's very difficult. And it may be that it's a contradiction in terms, but that's the ideal.
It is certainly, I think, been said earlier in the inquiry that government leaks.
It does. But what you don't typically have in government is a mixture of politicians who are by definition adversarial to each other in wanting to remove each other from office in the sense they belong to different parties. And
but Mr. Johnson,
that's one of the complexities that the pandemic threw up.
The questions that were being discussed in these meetings weren't about that sort of thing. They were about dates and times and what should be used, whether we should use masks, or there wasn't a necessity or scope for that in those meetings.
Well, I think what happened was that every topic rapidly became political because, of course, different constituencies in different parts of the country had different views about things, and that's the sad reality. I'm not saying this problem is insoluble. I'm just saying that within the time that we had available, it was hard to manage. I thought the best way to manage it, given the urgency, was to try to take the heat out of things, to get CDL to bring people together, to explain and to conciliate, yes, and if necessary, I would come in and talk to people as much as I could.
We've heard that, Mr. Johnson. I wonder if I can have inquiry number 000136751 up, please. This is an email from Imran Shafi to Chris Whitty, and it relates to a meeting on the 14th of March. There was a meeting on the 14th of March involving yourself, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, CLD, the CMO, the CSA and other senior officials. There was no DA presence at this meeting, so no one from Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, which discussed the need for a cross-government signed-off package on shielding the vulnerable and elderly. It was noted that the decision on when to implement this package would be based on advice from the CMO and the CSA. The advice was to include how to handle the DAs. And you can see that in respect of the particular document at the very last entry on number 1. What did you understand, or what do you understand by the phrase, how to handle the DAs?
Well, I think that the inquiry will know very well the context of this email within the timetable of COVID. It's coming the very day, in the early afternoon of the very day when we've realised that we're behind in the curve, and that we have to take very urgent action.
Indeed, Mr. Johnson.
What this email reflects is the view of my Private Secretary Imran that we've got to get onto the DAs as fast as possible.
Well, what is meant how to handle the DAs? I mean, you say it's his view, but you were there at the meeting, and this meeting concluded with action points, and it's the first action point.
Well, the question would have been who to ring, how to set the ball rolling, how to bring people together.
Earlier on in your evidence yesterday, you were asked about mass gatherings. And I think it would be fair to say that broadly you accepted that it had been the wrong call to allow mass gatherings to go ahead. Is that correct? Well,
I think what I said was that the advice on mass gatherings was that it was paradoxical in the sense that it was counterintuitive, because the scientific advice was that they were banning mass gatherings could be worse because you would drive people into smaller locations, pubs and so on, where the transmission would be even higher. That was the logic.
I think Mr. Whitty described it as, in a sense, technically correct, but logically incoherent to the general public.
I think that it was put to me that it was logically coherent in the sense that we wanted to reduce we wanted to do what we could to reduce transmission, and it was put to me that banning mass gatherings itself would not really help because for the reason I've given.
Can I have the document inquiry number 000129230? This is a WhatsApp message with yourself dated 11/3, 2020. As we can see, it reads, I spoke to Chris Whitty at length about your concerns about the comms tomorrow getting overcomplicated. He thinks there's a really simple way of describing what we want people to do in future, based on from Monday, if you're ill, stay home. He's going to make sure that by Cobra, we're in a good position. However, he also thinks the Scots are going soft on mass gatherings, and that Nicola has decided she definitely wants to move on some totemic cancellations. Now, the reason I flag this up is this is being used as a possible reason for Scotland just doing things differently. Would it be fair to say that, in fact, in retrospect, the correct call was to call off those gatherings and to send the correct signal to the public that this was an important thing and everybody had to be very careful about their health?
I can't say how much of a difference it would have made at that stage. What I've tried to tell you is the reasons why we, at a very early stage in our understanding of the pandemic, had gone for one option, and what you've clearly got here is for what we thought were sound epidemiological reasons, and what you've got is Scotland using its prerogatives to do something different. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the epidemiology, you have a divergence of approach.
Indeed, and what I'm asking you is retrospectively.
The risk is that in the end, you start to undermine public understanding.
Indeed, the inquiry has heard that and understands it. What I am asking you to reflect upon is, retrospectively, was that the right call?
I can't say. I think that what certainly wasn't helpful throughout was to have different messages.
Well, that's exactly the matter I'm coming on to. The issue of differential messaging is one which has peppered your evidence so far. In your statement at page 30, I don't need that brought up, but in your statement at page 30, paragraph 126, it says, looking back, we should have thought much harder about the legal basis for the measures proposed. There's a respectable argument that we should have used civil contingencies legislation rather than public health. By allowing for at least the appearance of divergence in approach between the various parts of the UK, we were risking considerable public confusion and frustration when clarity of message was crucial. Now, given, as you've already identified, the prerogative of devolved administrations, in particular Scotland, where health is a devolved matter in Scotland, where Scotland has access to its own data, its own government, its own CMO, its own DCMO, and it has, I suppose, the best view on what's happening in its own area, i.e. the different spread of COVID perhaps between the Scottish Islands and London. Are your comments fair or proper?
My comments on...
Is your comment that the appearance of divergence in approach between the various parts of the UK we're risking considerable public confusion and frustration?
Well, I think that
clarity?
obviously that's for the inquiry to decide. But I think I'm really grateful to you for raising all this. But I was worried that there was a continual dissonance of messaging, and I was worried that would do two things. It would confuse people, and that in the end it would undermine people's confidence in the message. One or other of these points had to be
I would
right.
like to,
which one was it?
And I would like to take you to that. First of all, I've got two issues left. First of all, the stay alert message. You say clarity and consistency are important, you are sensitive to this, that the messaging was so important and you were concerned that people found it hard to follow. The fact was, the message was stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives, and it was changed by the UK government by itself to stay alert. Did you have any communications with the devolved administration saying that you were going to change it?
Well, I think the previous council for, I believe it was the Welsh bereaved families, indicated that there had been a consultation about that.
Had there been well, if I may put this to you, if there was such a meeting and conversations were had, why was consistency of messaging not an issue when the UK government decided to change its advice, but the other three devolved administrations didn't?
I think perhaps I could put it this way: the pandemic changed and the virus changed and its virulence, and we had to change our response. And
I think the difficulty...
I think that the just to complete the point, I think the problem was that we would find sometimes that there was a difference in message. I don't want to make too much heavy weather of this, but I think sometimes it was a problem. That
brings me to my last point, but just before I leave the issue of stay alert, Professor Halpern has given evidence to this inquiry that the phrase that was changed was so bad because it told you to worry and it didn't tell you what to do. He described it as the worst combination, and I would respectfully allow you to reflect upon that. If I can take you on to my final point, and it's in relation to a report, an expert report, which has been heard detail of in this inquiry by Professor Ailsa Henderson, and it's about confusing messages. Now, you have said in your evidence that messaging was incredibly important. Messaging in the end was the most important tool we had to deal with the virus. I don't think we should deprecate the importance of messaging. So at the heart of what you were doing, you thought messaging was a vitally, a critical tool in relation to the pandemic. If we can have before us inquiry number 000269372, the report by Professor Ailsa Henderson, page 49, paragraphs 151 and 152. This is about advice given by the UK government over communications with the public. if about halfway down the paragraph it starts an analysis of text-prepared speeches. An analysis of the text-prepared speeches throughout 2020 shows that those speaking on behalf of the UK Government did an incomplete job of outlining the territorial scope of their data, information or guidance. In the first months, there was almost no mention of devolved administrations or their First Ministers. There was little attempt to outline what applied UK-wide and what applied only to England. The phrase "this country" was employed frequently to mean England or Great Britain or the United Kingdom. In general, spokespeople were slightly more likely to clarify if a UK-wide matter applied to the whole of the UK. And it goes on to give an instance. Given by your own admission the critical nature of the communications and the fact that messaging was the most important tool the UK had to deal with the virus, was sufficient consideration given by the UK Government to ensuring that the geographical, jurisdictional of their data and information and guidance was made clear?
Well, I did my level best during the press conferences to try to make clear where the restrictions applied to. And I remember several times saying that they applied only in England and trying to restrict what we were saying. But I think,
well, Mr. Johnson, I have one example.
You can't blame ministers for talking about this country when that's common parlance. And if I may say,
that ministers are talking on behalf of the UK Government to all the people that they are getting it. So if they say this country, it has to be made clear which country it refers to. For example,
we're all one country.
For example, on the 23rd of June 2020, you clarified that measures applied to England only, and that's the one occasion it appears that's been highlighted, and then set out rules to follow for the British public. What was needed was clarity, and isn't it, in fact, that the problem was that the difficulty was created by the UK Government?
No.
Later on in this report, it says that notwithstanding efforts throughout 2020, the UK COVID press briefings repeatedly failed to clarify rules governing school closures, rules for social gathering, funds for local authorities, funds for the coronavirus community support, the renewal task force, dedicated funding for mental health, bike voucher schemes, increased marshals on rail works, the reopening of car showrooms or other retails were all England specific. And they say this is, the report goes on to say this is particularly important as in some instances government spokespeople were calling for individuals to change their behaviour, and as such rules would not have applied throughout the UK. Indeed, it was advice about rules rather than data that suffered from a particular lack of clarity. So, given what is said in this report, Mr Johnston, did the UK Government fail to properly implement the most important tool the UK Government had to deal with the virus?
I think that if you look at the public understanding of what we were trying to say, it was remarkable how clearly people got the message, considering the extreme complexity of the rules and considering the fact that there was divergence,
Mr Johnson,
across the DAs.
Given the complexity,
what I think what you've got here is in all this conversation a perfect example of how different messaging can be confusing for ministers, for people across the whole of the UK. The virus thinks whatever the SNP may think, the virus thinks this is all one country.
I'm not asking...
That's the reality.
I'm not asking questions about the SNP. I'm asking questions about you and your minister's messaging during the pandemic. You have said that what it was extremely complex issues, and there may be no doubt that that was so, but wouldn't that be all the more reason that you made absolutely clear every time you stood up and spoke to the four nations, that you made it absolutely clear what the rules were for each nation in each country?
Well, I could have done that. I think that might indeed be a way forward. I think it may be that you've hit on a solution, which is that in future it should be entirely the job of the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to announce the different rules that apply in different places across the UK, rather than having those messages blurred or anticipated. I happen to think that would still be immensely complicated, and people wouldn't understand quite why there were differences. All I'm saying is that I think there were legitimate democratic desire of the DAs to have their own approach to public health. I totally get that and I support that. But in the particular context of a brutal, pitiless pandemic, there had to be some way of helping the public with greater unity of messaging. That's all I'm saying.
And the best way to have such, the best way is not to look for unity, but to look for clarity. Would that be correct?
I think that clarity follows unity.
I think that we've gone far enough
I'm
on that front.
obliged.
This is not going to become a seminar with respect.